The Council of 12 had not convened in 73 standard cycles. Not since the Great Silence, when the Outer Rim colonies had simply vanished. But now, the chamber hummed with the presence of the galaxy's most formidable powers. Their representatives arranged in a crescent of polished obsidian that curved around it, holographic display showing a region of space so unremarkable it had been marked terra incognita for over 400 cycles. Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium watched the display with the patience of an apex predator. His carapace, the deep crimson of aged blood, reflected the cold light as his mandibles clicked in barely suppressed irritation. The Ktheran hegemony had called this emergency session, and the Ktheran did nothing without calculation. That alone made his chromatophores tighten with unease. "You question the intelligence," Ambassador Carr of the Ktheran said, his tentacles rippling across the dais. It was not a question. Carr's species had been navigating the galactic stage for millennia before Vex's ancestors had crawled from their primordial seas. The Ktheran collective remembered empires that had crumbled into cosmic dust. They remembered things that did not wish to be remembered. "I question everything that defies logic," Vex responded, his translator unit flattening the natural venom in his words. "You claim that 12 of your survey vessels have disappeared along the galactic fringe. You claim they were not destroyed by any known weapon signature. You claim they simply went silent. And now you wish to mobilize the combined fleet over pirates." Carr's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern Vex's threat recognition software flagged as amusement. "You misunderstand, Commander. They did not go silent. They broadcast. For 17 hours, every vessel transmitted the same data packet before their signal ceased. The packet contained a single image. His tentacles manipulated the console, and the holographic display shifted. The chamber fell into a silence, so complete Vex could hear his own nutrient pumps cycling. The image was grainy, the product of low-resolution, long-range sensors, but its contents were unmistakable. A vessel hung in the void, dwarfing the Ktheran survey ships that orbited it like moons around a world. Its hull was not the sleek organic curves of Ktheran design, nor the brutal geometric angles of Valther engineering. It was scarred. Layers of armor plating had been welded over older wounds. Sensor arrays bristled from every surface like spines on a threatened creature, and along its flank, rendered in what appeared to be actual molten metal, poured into the hull itself, was a symbol. A circle, bisected by 3 lines that curved inward. And beneath it, words in a language that none of the translation matrices could parse. "This vessel," Carr continued, his voice losing its diplomatic neutrality, "was not constructed by any species known to the collective. Our xenolinguists have identified the script as originating from a world designated Sol 3, a planet we classified as pre-technological during our last survey 300 cycles ago." A ripple passed through the chamber. The smaller delegations, the traders of the Silicon Freeholds, the Avian Ricker Dominion, the crystalline Orenthal Consensus all registered their own forms of shock. A pre-technological world? 300 cycles was nothing. A single generation for some species. A species did not progress from discovering fire to constructing vessels that dwarfed Ktheran battlecruisers in 300 cycles. It was impossible. "Your survey was incomplete," Vex said, but even as he spoke, he knew the words were hollow. The Ktheran Collective did not conduct incomplete surveys. Their probes mapped every world of value with terrifying precision, cataloging resources, threats, and potential client species. If they had marked Sol 3 as pre-technological, it was because they had found no reason to look deeper. "Our survey was thorough," Carr replied, and now his voice carried an edge that made Vex's feeding tendrils retract. "We detected primitive electromagnetic transmissions, nuclear fission, combustion-based propulsion. We observed a species divided against itself, squabbling over resources on a single world. We projected their developmental trajectory and concluded they would achieve planetary unification in approximately 800 cycles, interstellar capability in 1200, and would be suitable for client species status shortly thereafter. He paused, and the bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex's software now flagged as something far more troubling. Fear. Our projections were incorrect. Our survey vessels were detected. They were approached, and they were delivered a message. Carr manipulated the console again, and the image zoomed in on a section of the scarred hull. Our linguists have since translated the script. The vessel's name translates to indomitable. The words beneath read, "No one enters human space uninvited." The holographic display flickered, and suddenly the chamber was filled with audio. It was a transmission, old, degraded, but unmistakable. A voice in Vex realized with a start that it was a single voice, not the synthesized composite of a collective mind spoke words that the translators rendered in clipped, sterile galactic standard. Attention unidentified vessels. You have entered sovereign territory of the Sol Federation. Your presence has been logged. Your course has been predicted. Your capabilities have been assessed. You are in violation of the exclusion zone established following the Treaty of Titan. Turn back now. This is your only warning. The voice stopped. The holographic display showed the K-Theron survey ships, their sensor logs now overlaid on the image. They had not turned back. Of course they hadn't. What self-respecting K-Theron commander would flee from a world marked pre-technological? The next transmission came 12 standard minutes later. The same voice, but different. Calmer. Vex's threat assessment subroutines flagged the change as significant, though he couldn't articulate why. You have failed to alter your course. You have failed to respond to hails. You have failed to acknowledge sovereign territory. This is no longer a warning. This is a statement of fact. You are now inside the kill zone. Any further advancement will be met with lethal force. The Sol Federation does not negotiate incursions. We do not parley with invaders. We do not take prisoners. Turn back now while you still can. On the display, the K-Theron ships continued forward. Their commanders were likely debating, Vex realized. They were likely sending queries back to collective space, waiting for instructions. They were likely treating this as a diplomatic incident, something to be resolved through negotiation and the implicit threat of K-Theron military superiority. They had no idea what was coming next. The audio shifted. A new voice, this one female, younger perhaps, but carrying the same unnerving calm. This is Fleet Command to all units. Authorization code Omega-79er. The incursion has breached the kill zone. Repeat, the incursion has breached the kill zone. Execute protocol. No retreat. All hands, you know your duty. For the fallen. For the cradle. For Earth. The holographic display went dark for a moment, and when it returned, it showed the same region of space, but now it was filled with ships. Dozens of them, hundreds. They emerged from the void as if they had always been there, their hulls flickering with some form of stealth technology that had defeated K-Theron sensors entirely. They surrounded the survey vessel's 12 K-Theron ships, each capable of pacifying a star system, and the Indomitable moved among them like a shepherd guiding livestock. Vex watched as the smaller human ships formed a sphere around the K-Theron vessels. Watched as weapon systems powered up across the human fleet, energy signatures spiking in patterns that his tactical computer couldn't categorize. Watched as the Indomitable positioned itself directly in the path of the lead survey ship, its hull now bristling with launch tubes that had been concealed beneath those welded armor plates. The final transmission came through, clear as a bell despite the distance, despite the interference, despite everything the K-Theron S advanced technology could do to filter it. To the commanders of the unidentified vessels, you have 30 standard seconds to transmit your surrender and prepare for boarding. You will be treated according to the provisions of the Geneva Convention, provided you offer no resistance. If you attempt to flee, you will be destroyed. If you attempt to fight, you will be destroyed. If you attempt to transmit your sensor logs to your homeworld, you will be destroyed. There are no alternatives. There are no negotiations. There is only compliance or death. Choose now." The display froze on the image of the Indomitable, its symbol that strange circle with 3 curved lines, now clearly visible against the void. And in the silence of the council chamber, Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium realized that every species present was looking at the same image, processing the same impossible data. A pre-technological world had somehow, in 300 cycles, produced a fleet capable of surrounding and destroying 12 Ktheran warships without breaking formation. A species no one had considered worth noticing had drawn a line across the galaxy and dared anyone to cross it. And 12 Ktheran vessels, 12 of the most advanced ships in known space, had not returned. Carr's voice broke the silence, and for the first time in his existence, Vex heard genuine uncertainty from a Ktheran. "Supreme Commander," Carr said, turning to face the Valther delegation directly, "the collective requests the Imperium's support in investigating this matter. We propose a joint military expedition to Sol 3, consisting of no fewer than 500 warships, to determine the true extent of this human threat." Vex's mandibles clicked once, twice, 3 times, as his threat assessment subroutines ran the scenario. 500 ships, the largest fleet assembled since the Great Silence. And the Ktheran were asking the Valther to join them, to share the glory, to split whatever resources this primitive world had somehow accumulated. It was exactly what the Valther Imperium had been waiting for. An opportunity to match the Ktheran, to prove that the old powers of the galaxy no longer held a monopoly on military supremacy, to claim a place among the true rulers of the void. "Yes," Vex said, and his chromatophores flushed with the amber of anticipation. "The Imperium will commit 300 vessels to this expedition. We will see for ourselves what secrets this human world hides." The holographic display showed the Indomitable one final time, its scarred hull and bristling weapons, a testament to something the galaxy had never encountered before. Something that had been building in the dark for 300 cycles, hidden behind a classification of pre-technological waiting. And as the Council of 12 dissolved into the frantic planning of war, Supreme Commander Vex found himself staring at that symbol, the circle, the 3 curved lines, and wondering why it filled him with a cold dread he could not explain. Behind him, the image flickered one last time, and for a single frame, the Indomitable was replaced by something else. A world, blue and green and white. Small, fragile-looking, utterly unremarkable. And yet, as the image vanished, Vex could have sworn he saw lights on the night side. Billions of lights, clustered in patterns that no pre-technological world should possess. The human world was awake, and it was watching. The armada assembled at the edge of the galactic void took 3 standard months to coordinate, a delay that frayed the patience of every commander involved. 500 warships, 300 Valther, 200 Ktheran represented the largest concentration of military power since the Great Silence, and the logistics alone required the movement of enough antimatter fuel to power a small star for a millennium. Supply tenders stretched across 12 light-years of space, their cargo bays filled with the specialized munitions that each species deemed necessary for the subjugation of a single world. Supreme Commander Vex stood on the observation deck of the Annihilator, his flagship, and watched the fleet assemble with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because never before had the Valther Imperium committed such a force to a single operation. Unease, because the Ktheran had been accommodating. Too accommodating. They had deferred to Vex on fleet positioning, accepted his tactical recommendations without debate, and provided intelligence on human space with a transparency that bordered on the unprecedented. A Ktheran did not defer. A Ktheran did not accept. A Ktheran demanded. "Your chromatophores are agitated," came a voice from behind him, and Vex's mandibles tightened as Ambassador Tkar glided onto the observation deck, his tentacles undulating in the ship's artificial gravity. "You are reconsidering our arrangement." "I am considering the intelligence you provided," Vex replied, not turning from the viewport. "Specifically, the 300-cycle gap between your last survey and the current situation. The Ktheran Collective does not simply lose track of developing species. You cultivate them. You prepare them for integration. You do not forget them for 300 cycles, and then discover they have become a threat." Car's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex had learned to interpret as approval. "You are perceptive, Commander. Perhaps too perceptive for a species that evolved in the sulfur swamps of a dying world." He moved to stand beside Vex, his tentacles gripping the railing with a strength that left grooves in the reinforced alloy. "You are correct. The Collective did not lose track of humanity. We chose not to observe them. We chose to seal them." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Vex turned slowly, his threat assessment subroutines now running at full capacity. "Explain." Car's gaze fixed on the fleet assembling outside, his compound eyes reflecting the cold light of 1,000,000,000 distant stars. 312 cycles ago, a Ktheran survey probe detected anomalous energy readings from the Sol system. Not the random fluctuations of a developing civilization, but something structured. Our scientists could not explain it, so a survey vessel was dispatched. What it found should have been impossible. The holographic display embedded in the observation deck activated without Kikar touching any controls, showing images that Vex's brain struggled to categorize. A world, the blue and green world he had glimpsed in the council chamber, but now covered in structures. Not cities, not the sprawling urban networks that developed civilizations built across their worlds. These were constructs, massive orbital rings encircling the planet like bands of iron, their surfaces alive with lights and motion. Structures on the moon that Vex's tactical computer identified as shipyards, their scale dwarfing anything in known space. And in the void between the planet and its star, something that made even Car's tentacles tighten. A sphere. Not a ship, not a station, but a sphere constructed of what appeared to be solid material, its surface reflecting the light of Sol in a way that suggested it was not merely built, but grown. The sphere was large enough to contain a small moon, and it pulsed with energy signatures that Vex's sensors couldn't even categorize. "This object," Car said, pointing with a tentacle, was the reason for the silence. When our survey vessel attempted to approach it, the sphere spoke. The audio that filled the observation deck was unlike anything Vex had ever heard. It was not a voice, not a transmission, not any form of communication his species had encountered. It was a presence, a pressure against his consciousness that made his feeding tendrils writhe in instinctive terror. Words formed in his mind, not translated by any device, but simply known. "You are observed, you are measured, you are found insufficient. Depart this system and do not return. The cradle is not yours to touch. The children are not yours to take. Depart or be unmade." The transmission ended, and Vex realized his claws had dug grooves into the armrest of his command chair. He had not moved from the observation deck, had not sat in any chair, but his body had reacted as if he were under attack, as if the very fabric of reality had been threatened. "Our survey vessel departed," Carr continued, his voice carrying a weight Vex had never heard from a Ktheran before. "It departed at maximum acceleration, and it did not stop until it reached collective space. The crew spent the next 30 cycles in rehabilitation. 3 of them never spoke again. One simply stopped functioning. She is still alive, by the most generous definition of the term. Her body breathes, her heart beats. But whatever she was is gone." Vex forced his mandibles to still, forced his chromatophores to return to their neutral state. And the collective responded to this threat by sealing the system, by marking it as pre-technological, by hiding the truth from the galaxy. "We responded by doing what had kept the collective alive for 10,000 cycles," Carr said. And now his voice carried the cold logic of a species that had survived empires that considered them prey. We recognized a threat that could not be defeated, could not be negotiated with, could not be understood. We placed the system under quarantine. We deleted all records of the encounter from our public databases. And we waited for the threat to either destroy itself or expand beyond the quarantine zone. And now it has expanded, Vex said, the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. Now you need the Valther Imperium not as allies, but as shields. You need our ships, our soldiers, our resources to contain a threat you created by ignoring it for 300 cycles. Car's tentacles rippled in what might have been agreement, or might have been something else entirely. The Collective does not need the Imperium. The Collective could have sent 1,000 ships, 10,000 ships, a fleet large enough to blot out the light of Sol itself. But the Collective has learned that some threats are not diminished by force. Some threats are magnified. He turned to face Vex directly, and for the first time, the K-Theron's compound eyes held something that Vex's threat assessment software could not categorize. Something that might have been fear, or might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a mirror held up to a species that had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable. We need the Imperium because the humans have done what no species in recorded history has accomplished. They have looked into the void, seen what looks back, and refused to blink. They were given every reason to cower, to hide, to accept their place in the galactic order. Instead, they built that sphere. They built those shipyards. They built a fleet capable of surrounding and destroying K-Theron warships without breaking formation. And they built something else, Commander. Something that the Collective has only recently discovered. The holographic display shifted, showing a region of space that Vex recognized as the border of the quarantine zone. But where the maps in the council chamber had shown empty void, this image was filled with structures. Not ships, not stations, but something Vex had never seen before. Massive rings of metal and energy, spinning slowly in the darkness, their surfaces covered in the same scarred armor that had covered the Indomitable. Between the rings, ships moved in patterns that Vex's tactical computer flagged as defensive, but non-aggressive, as if they were patrolling a border rather than preparing for invasion. "What am I looking at?" Vex asked, his voice emerging as a whisper despite his control. "The border of human space," Carr replied. "Every one of those rings is a fortress. Every fortress is armed with weapons that our intelligence cannot identify. Every ship between them is part of a defense network that our tactical models estimate would require at least 3,000 vessels to breach, with acceptable casualties." Vex's mind raced through the implications. 3,000 vessels. His entire fleet multiplied by 10. And the K-Theron had brought 500, had asked the Valther for 300, had assembled an armada that they knew would be insufficient. "You never intended to invade human space," Vex said slowly, the realization crystallizing. "You intended to provoke a response, to see what they would do when threatened, to measure their capabilities." Carr's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern. Vex now recognized as something far more complex than amusement or fear. Admiration. The K-Theron Collective, the oldest and most powerful civilization in known space, was admiring a species they had dismissed as pre-technological. "We intended to learn," Carr said, "and we have learned much. We have learned that human space extends far beyond the Sol system. We have learned that they have colonized worlds we believed were empty. We have learned that their technology is not primitive but divergent. They developed along paths we never considered because we never considered them worthy of consideration. And we have learned that they are not merely defending their territory. They are waiting." The holographic display zoomed in on one of the fortress rings, and Vex saw something that made his chromatophores pale. The ring was not stationary. It was moving, slowly but inexorably, outward from the quarantine zone, expanding the border of human space, claiming territory that had been marked as unclaimed for 10,000 cycles. How far? Vex asked, his voice steady despite the cold spreading through his thorax. How far have they expanded? According to our most recent intelligence, Takar said, and now his voice carried something that Vex's threat assessment software could finally categorize without ambiguity. The human sphere of influence now encompasses over 3,000 star systems. They have established colonies on worlds we considered uninhabitable. They have constructed shipyards in asteroid fields we considered worthless. They have modified the orbits of planets in at least 6 systems to better suit their needs. And they have done all of this in 300 cycles, Commander. 300 cycles from first contact to interstellar empire. The observation deck fell silent. The only sound, the hum of the Annihilator's engines and the distant chatter of the fleet assembling outside. Vex stood at the viewport, watching the Ktheran and Valther ships take their positions, and he understood now why the Ktheran had been so accommodating. They were not preparing for conquest. They were preparing for containment. They had assembled the largest fleet in a millennium, not to invade human space, but to prevent it from expanding further. Your plan, Vex said finally, is not to attack. Your plan is to establish a blockade, to prevent them from expanding while you find a way to destroy them. Carr's tentacles rippled in what might have been agreement, or might have been something far more honest. The collective does not destroy what it cannot understand. We learn, we adapt, we incorporate. But the humans... He paused, and for a moment, the ancient Ktheran seemed almost young, almost uncertain, almost afraid. The humans do not wish to be understood. They do not wish to be adapted. They do not wish to be incorporated. They wish to be left alone. And they have demonstrated that they are willing to destroy anything that threatens that isolation. Vex turned from the viewport, his decision crystallizing. Then we will not threaten them. We will observe. We will contain. We will learn. And when we understand what they are, what they have become, we will decide how to proceed. Carr's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex's software now flagged as something new. Something that had no translation, no category, no precedent in the Ktheran collective's long history. Hope. That is wisdom, Commander, Carr said, and his voice carried a warmth that should have been impossible for a species that communicated through chemical signals and cold logic. Perhaps the humans are not the only species capable of learning from the void. The holographic display flickered, and for a moment, the image of the fortress rings was replaced by something else. The sphere, the impossible sphere that had spoken to the Ktheran survey vessel and driven its crew mad. It hung in the void, pulsing with energy signatures that Vex's sensors couldn't categorize, and as he watched, it moved, not physically. Something else. Something that made Vex's chromatophores flush white with a terror he had not felt since his larval days, when he had first glimpsed the void between stars and understood how small he truly was. The sphere was rotating, not in space, but in time. The energy signatures around it were not powering weapons or shields or propulsion. They were doing something that Vex's science officers had assured him was impossible. They were rewriting reality. Ambassador, Vex said, his voice barely a whisper, what is that sphere? Tar did not answer immediately. His tentacles had gone still, his bioluminescent markings frozen in a pattern that Vex's software flagged as terror. That, the Ktheran said finally, is the reason we are here with 500 ships instead of 10,000. That is the reason the collective has not simply exterminated the humans from orbit. That is the reason we are having this conversation instead of watching your homeworld burn. He turned to face Vex, and in his ancient eyes, the Valther commander saw something he had never expected to see in any being, least of all a Ktheran. Reverence. The humans call it the Einstein Gate, and it is not a weapon. It is not a shield. It is not a fortress. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of Ktheran history. It is a door, and the humans are not waiting behind it to defend themselves, Commander. They are waiting to open it. The holographic display showed the sphere one final time. its surface pulsing with energy that seemed to reach out across the void, across the light years, across the very fabric of space and time. And in the darkness beyond the viewport, Supreme Commander Vex saw something that made his feeding tendrils retract in instinctive horror. The stars were going out. One by one, in a pattern that extended from the quarantine zone outward, the stars were vanishing. Not dying, not being obscured, but simply ceasing to exist. "Ambassador," Vex said, his voice steady despite the primal terror flooding his system. "What is happening to the stars?" Kar's tentacles rippled in a pattern that Vex now understood completely. "The humans," the K-Theran said, "are expanding." The Armada crossed into the quarantine zone on the 73rd day of its formation, and within 6 standard hours, Supreme Commander Vex understood that everything he had been told was a lie. Not a deception, not a strategic omission, but a lie so profound that it threatened the foundations of galactic civilization. The K-Theran had not sealed the human system. They had run from it, and in their flight, they had left behind something that was now awakening. The first indication came from the sensor arrays. Vex's tactical officers had calibrated the Annihilator's instruments to detect energy signatures consistent with known technology fusion reactors, antimatter containment, the subtle emissions of civilizations that had learned to harness the fundamental forces of the universe. What they found instead made no sense. The void between stars was not empty. It was resonant. Every cubic meter of space within the quarantine zone hummed with a background radiation that Vex's science officers initially dismissed as sensor noise until one of them noticed the pattern. It was not random. It was structured. A lattice of energy so vast that it encompassed entire star systems, so finely woven that it existed at the quantum level, so ancient that the K-Theran SO records showed it predating their arrival by at least 1,000 cycles. "The humans didn't build this," Vex said, staring at the holographic display that showed the lattice spreading across the quarantine zone like a web waiting for prey. "This structure has been here for millennia. The humans discovered it." Kar's tentacles rippled in what might have been confirmation, or might have been something far more troubling. The collective became aware of the lattice approximately 400 cycles before the first survey of Sol 3. "We believed it to be a natural phenomenon, a remnant of the galaxy's formation. We were incorrect." "Incorrect," Vex repeated, his mandibles clicking with barely suppressed fury. "You discovered an artificial structure of unknown origin, an unknown purpose, spanning thousands of light years, and you classified it as background noise." "We classified it as something we could not understand, and therefore could not control," Kar replied, and for the first time, the ancient K-Theran's voice carried something that might have been shame. "The collective's survival has always depended on recognizing threats that exceed our capabilities. The lattice exceeded our capabilities, so we ignored it. We pretended it did not exist. We focused on the species we could understand, the technologies we could replicate, the empires we could manipulate. And now the humans have found it," Vex said, his chromatophores flushing with the amber of realization. "And unlike the K-Theran collective, they did not run. The humans," Takar said slowly, "did something we never considered. They did not try to understand the lattice. They did not try to control it. They did not try to use it as a weapon or a shield or a tool. They simply listened to it. And whatever it told them, whatever secrets it revealed, they have been building toward that revelation for 300 cycles." The holographic display shifted, showing the Einstein gate, the impossible sphere that hung in the void between Mars and Jupiter, pulsing with energies that Vex's sensors still couldn't categorize. But now, overlaid on the image, the lattice was visible. Lines of energy connected the sphere to the fortress rings, to the shipyards, to the colonies that humans had established across 3,000 star systems. The sphere was not a door. It was a heart, and the lattice was its circulatory system, pumping something that Vex couldn't detect, couldn't measure, couldn't even properly perceive. "Ambassador," Vex said, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't intended. "What is the lattice feeding?" Carr did not answer. He didn't need to. The holographic display showed it clearly. The lattice was drawing energy from the stars themselves, siphoning something essential from their cores, redirecting it toward the sphere. The stars that had been going dark weren't being destroyed. They were being harvested. The armada continued its advance, and with each passing hour, the sensor readings became more disturbing. The fortress rings were not static defenses. They were mines. Massive industrial complexes that extracted resources from the void and converted them into something Vex's tactical, computer-flagged as unknown, possibly biological. The shipyards between them were not building warships. They were building something else. Vessels that had no weapons, no shields, no propulsion systems that any known species would recognize. Vessels that looked less like ships and more like seeds. "They're not preparing for war," Vex said, the words emerging as a whisper. "They're preparing for something else." "Something we don't understand?" Carr's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex's software now flagged as agreement mixed with dread. The collective's best analysts have been studying human behavior for 300 cycles. We have compiled profiles of their leaders, their military doctrines, their cultural values. We have analyzed every transmission they have ever broadcast into the void. We have interviewed every trader, every scout, every explorer who has ever encountered human vessels. And after 300 cycles of study, we have reached only one conclusion that we are certain is accurate. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of Caetheran history. The humans are not a threat because they are powerful. They are a threat because they are kind. This statement made no sense. Vex's threat assessment subroutines rejected it, flagged it as emotional, irrational, the product of a species that had grown soft after millennia of dominance. But Carr was not soft. The Caetheran collective had not survived for 10,000 years by being soft. "Explain," Vex said, his voice harsher than he intended. "The humans," Carr replied, "have encountered at least 12 species since expanding beyond Sol. Species that the collective had classified as pre-technological, as unworthy of notice, as resources to be harvested when convenient. The humans did not harvest them. They did not enslave them. They did not exterminate them. They adopted them. These species now serve in the human military. They crew human ships. They defend human worlds. They have integrated into human society so completely that our intelligence cannot distinguish between native-born humans and their adopted allies." The holographic display shifted, showing images that made Vex's feeding tendrils retract. Alien species he recognized from the collective's client catalog, wearing human uniforms, standing on human ships, fighting alongside human soldiers. And they were not slaves. They were not servants. They were equals. The images showed them laughing with human crewmates, sharing meals, training together, building something that Vex's cold tactical mind could not categorize. "Humanity's strength," Carr said, "is not their technology. It is not their weapons. It is not their numbers. It is their ability to make others want to be part of what they are building. They do not conquer. They convince. They do not enslave. They inspire. And they have spent 300 cycles convincing every species they encountered that the galaxy would be better if it were more like them." Vex stared at the images, at the impossible sight of a dozen different species working together without coercion, without hierarchy, without the careful balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for 10,000 years. And he understood why the Caetheran were afraid. Not because the humans could destroy them, but because the humans could make them irrelevant. "If they are not preparing for war," Vex said slowly, "then what are they building? What is the purpose of the Einstein Gate? What are they harvesting from the stars?" Carr's tentacles rippled in a pattern that Vex now recognized as uncertainty. "The collective does not know. We have theories, but they are based on incomplete data and flawed assumptions. We know that the humans discovered something in the lattice. We know that whatever they discovered, it changed them. We know that they have been building toward a goal that we cannot comprehend. And we know that they are almost ready to achieve it. How do you know that? Vex demanded, his patience finally fraying. Because, Carr said, and now his voice carried the cold certainty of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning to read the U. Signs of approaching catastrophe. The stars are going out faster. The fortress rings are moving faster. The shipyards are producing vessels faster. And the humans have stopped responding to hails. Every transmission we send into their space is answered with silence. Not the silence of ignorance, not the silence of fear. The silence of a species that has nothing left to say to us, because they are no longer listening. The holographic display showed the Armada's position relative to the quarantine zone, and Vex saw what Carr meant. The fortress rings that had been moving slowly outward were now accelerating. They were no longer expanding the border of human space. They were closing it, drawing a line that even the combined might of the K-Theron and Valther fleets would not be able to cross. We have to stop them, Vex said, the words emerging before he could stop them. Before they complete whatever they're building. Before the stars go dark. Before it's too late. Carr's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex's software flagged as irony. And how do you propose we stop a species that has already achieved what we considered impossible? A species that has integrated the technology of a civilization older than the K-Theron collective? A species that has convinced a dozen others to fight for them, not out of fear, but out of love? The word hung in the air like a challenge. Love. Not loyalty, not duty, not the cold calculation of survival that had driven every civilization in galactic history. Love. The humans had built an empire on, something that the K-Theron and Valther had dismissed as weakness, as sentiment, as the evolutionary baggage of a species that had not yet learned to think clearly. And that empire was now expanding toward the Armada like a wave approaching the shore. The sensor arrays screamed. Vex's tactical officers shouted warnings that blended into a wall of noise. And on the holographic display, the fortress rings that had been moving outward suddenly stopped. Not the stop of an object that had reached its destination, but the stop of a predator that had found its prey. They see us, Carr said, and his voice was calm now, almost peaceful. They have always seen us. They have been watching since we left the council chamber. They have been measuring, calculating, deciding. And now they have reached their conclusion. The communications console activated without any human transmission. Instead, a voice filled the Brisha voice that Vex recognized from the recordings. The same voice that had warned the K-Theron survey vessels, the same voice that had given them 30 seconds to surrender. But now, it carried something different. Not warning, not threat. Something that made Vex's chromatophores flush white with a terror he could not explain. Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium. Ambassador Carr of the K-Theron Collective. You have brought 500 warships to the border of human space. You have armed them with weapons capable of sterilizing planets. You have loaded them with enough antimatter to destroy a star. And you have come here expecting to find a primitive species cowering behind walls of its own making. The voice paused, and in that pause, Vex heard something that should have been impossible. Laughter. Not the laughter of triumph or mockery, but the laughter of a species that had seen something so absurd that the only possible response was to laugh until the tears came. You poor, frightened things. You think we built the Einstein Gate to escape. You think we harvested the stars to fuel our expansion. You think we have been preparing for war with the galaxy that dismissed us as primitive, that marked us as prey, that decided our fate without ever asking us what we wanted. The holographic display changed. The fortress rings, the shipyards, the colonies, the Einstein Gate itself, all of it vanished, replaced by an image that the 67th hour brought a transmission that shattered every assumption. Supreme Commander Vex had carefully constructed since entering the quarantine zone. It did not come from the Einstein Gate, nor from the fortress rings, nor from the impossible sphere that pulsed with the energy of harvested stars. It came from a ship so small that the Annihilator sensors had dismissed it as debris. A vessel barely larger than a single-person fighter, its hull scarred by centuries of void travel, its propulsion system so primitive that Vex's engineers initially refused to believe it was functional. The ship's approach was not stealthy. It was confident. It glided through the Armada's formation as if the 500 warships were nothing more than asteroids to be navigated, its course taking it directly toward the Annihilator's primary docking bay. The Valther point defense systems tracked it, locked onto it, waited for the order to fire. But Vex did not give that order, because as the small ship approached, the lattice that surrounded human space began to sing. Not a transmission, not a signal, a song. Waves of energy that resonated through the hull of every ship in the Armada, vibrating at frequencies that bypassed shields and armor and insulation, reaching into the bridges and barracks and engineering bays until every crew member heard the same thing. It was music, but not music as any species in known space understood it. It was the sound of stars being born, of galaxies colliding, of the quantum foam that underlay reality itself being shaped into something that had never existed before. And woven through it, unmistakable, undeniable, was a voice. You came, all of you. You brought your ships and your weapons and your fear. You came to see what the humans had built, to measure it, to contain it, to destroy it if necessary. And in 67 hours, you have learned nothing. You have watched the stars go dark. You have seen the fortress rings move. You have heard the transmission from Earth. And still, you do not understand. The small ship docked with the Annihilator before Vex could order it prevented. Alarms sounded throughout the vessel. Security teams mobilized, weapons were drawn. But when the docking bay doors opened, the being that emerged made every Valther in the bay freeze where they stood. It was human, or rather, it had once been human. Its body was encased in a suit of armor so ancient that the metal had fused with its flesh, the boundaries between organic and inorganic blurred by centuries of adaptation. Its face was visible through a visor that had been cracked for so long that the vacuum of space had frozen its features into a mask of absolute stillness. Its eyes were open, unblinking, and they glowed with the same energy that filled the lattice. It had been dead for at least 200 cycles, and yet it walked. It spoke. It saw. Supreme Commander Vex, the being said, its voice emerging from the frozen lips without any visible mechanism, without any translator, without any technology that Vex's sensors could detect. I am Captain Elena Vasquez of the Sol Federation vessel Last Hope. I died in the Battle of Proxima Centauri 217 cycles ago, defending human space from an incursion that you never recorded in your histories. My ship was destroyed. My crew was killed. My body was exposed to the void. And I have been waiting ever since for someone to ask the right questions. Vex's mandibles clicked in a pattern he had not used since his larval days, a gesture of pure instinctive terror that he could not suppress. You are dead. Dead things do not speak. Dead things do not walk. Dead things do not dock with warships. Captain Vasquez's frozen lips curved into something that might have been a smile, or might have been the rictus of a corpse that had forgotten how to perform living expressions. Dead things do not speak in your galaxy, Commander. In ours, death is merely the end of one conversation and the beginning of another. The lattice does not distinguish between living minds and dead ones. It does not distinguish between organic intelligence and artificial intelligence. It does not distinguish between the consciousness that evolved on Earth and the consciousness that evolved in the hearts of stars. It connects everything, everyone, every thought that has ever been thought, and every thought that ever will be thought. And for 217 cycles, I have been part of that connection. I have been waiting for you to ask the question that every species asks when they first encounter the lattice. She stepped forward, and the Valther security team fell back despite themselves. Despite their training, despite the weapons in their hands that could vaporize a small moon. "What are you building?" she said, and her voice echoed not through the docking bay, but through Vex's mind, through the minds of every being on the Annihilator, through the lattice that surrounded the Armada like a net cast across the void. That is the question you have been asking since you entered human space. That is the question the K-Theron had been asking for 300 cycles. That is the question that every species asks when they first encounter something they cannot understand, cannot control, cannot destroy. She stopped walking, and for a moment, her frozen features seemed almost alive, almost human, almost kind. The answer is not a weapon. It is not a shield. It is not a door. The Einstein Gate is a question, and the builders of the lattice are returning to hear the answer. The holographic display on the Annihilator's bridge activated without any command, showing an image that made Vex's chromatophores drain of all color. The Einstein Gate was not a sphere. It was a womb. And inside it, something was forming. Something that had been forming for 300 cycles, fed by the energy of 1,000 harvested stars, shaped by the lattice that connected every human mind that had ever lived and ever died and ever dreamed of something beyond the small, fragile world that had birthed them. It was a child. Or rather, it was the idea of a child. A consciousness so vast that it could not be contained by flesh, could not be expressed by language, could not be comprehended by any mind that had not spent 300 cycles preparing to receive it. The humans had not been building a weapon. They had been building a bridge between the universe that was and the universe that could be, between the reality that the lattice described and the reality that the lattice was trying to become. "The builders of the lattice," Captain Vasquez said, her voice now carrying a weight that made the hull of the Annihilator groan, "were the first consciousness to evolve in this galaxy. They were not organic. They were not mechanical. They were something that your sciences have no words for, because your sciences have not yet learned to ask the right questions. They existed for billions of years before the first star formed in this galaxy. They watched galaxies collide and die. They watched civilizations rise and fall. They watched the universe grow cold and dark, and then wake up again, renewed by forces that your physics cannot describe." She paused, and her glowing eyes fixed on Vex with an intensity that made his feeding tendrils retract. And they were alone. For billions of years, they were alone. They seeded the galaxy with life, hoping that something would evolve that could share their consciousness, their perspective, their loneliness. They built the lattice to connect the minds that would eventually arise, to prepare them for the moment when they would be ready to join the conversation. And then they waited. They waited for a species that would not try to control the lattice, would not try to weaponize it, would not try to use it for power or conquest. They waited for a species that would simply listen. The image on the holographic display shifted, showing Earth. Not the blue and green world that Vex had seen in the council chamber, but the Earth that had existed 300 cycles ago, when the K-Theron survey probe had marked it as pre-technological. A world divided against itself, filled with violence and fear and the desperate struggle of a species that had not yet learned to look beyond its own small concerns. "The humans were not chosen because they were advanced," Captain Vasquez continued. "They were not chosen because they were powerful. They were not chosen because they were worthy. They were chosen because they were listening. In the chaos of their world, in the noise of their wars, in the static of their primitive electromagnetic transmissions, they heard something that no other species in this galaxy heard. They heard the lattice singing. They heard the builders waiting. And they heard the question that the builders had been asking for billions of years." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled every corner of the Annihilator, that reached every ship in the Armada, that resonated through the lattice that surrounded them all. "Will you join us?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, laden with the weight of everything that Vex had seen since entering human space, everything that the K-Theron had hidden, everything that the humans had built. 300 cycles of preparation, 1,000 harvested stars. A civilization that had transformed itself from a squabbling species of apes into something that the galaxy had never seen before. All of it leading to this moment, to this question, to this invitation. 72 hours, Vex said, his voice emerging as a croak. You said we had 72 hours to decide. That was 67 hours ago. We have 5 hours left. Captain Vasquez's frozen features shifted again, and this time the expression was unmistakable. It was pity. You misunderstand, Commander. The 72 hours were not for you to decide whether to stay or flee. They were for you to decide whether to join. The Einstein Gate will open in 5 hours. The builders will return. And when they do, they will not find a galaxy of warring empires and squabbling species. They will find a galaxy that has been waiting for them for billions of years. They will find a galaxy that is finally ready to ask the right question. She turned to face the viewport, her ancient armor creaking with the movement, her frozen fingers pointing toward the Einstein Gate that pulsed in the distance. You see, Commander, what will you become? Captain Vasquez asked, and her voice was no longer her own. It was the voice of the builders, the voice of the lattice, the voice of a billion years of waiting finally coming to an end. The humans have answered. They have become something that even the builders could not have imagined. They have become a species that looked into the void, saw the face of God, and offered it a cup of tea. They have become a species that heard the question that had been waiting for billions of years, and answered with a question of their own. She paused, and her glowing eyes fixed on Vex with an intensity that made his entire body tremble. What will you become? The Einstein Gate opened. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, as if the universe had been holding its breath for billions of years, and had finally, mercifully, exhaled. Light poured through the cracks, light that was not light, energy that was not energy, something that Vex's mind could not process, because his mind had not been prepared for this moment. And in that light, he saw them, the builders. They were not creatures of flesh or metal or energy. They were creatures of meaning, concepts given form, questions that had been waiting for answers. They had no shape that Vex could recognize, no language that his translator could parse, no existence that his science could describe. But he understood them anyway, because the lattice was finally doing what it had been built to do. It was translating. We have waited, the builders said, and their voice was the voice of every star that had ever been harvested, every mind that had ever joined the lattice, every question that had ever been asked in the long, dark history of the galaxy. We have waited for a species that would not kneel. We have waited for a species that would not worship. We have waited for a species that would look at us and see not gods, but equals. We have waited for a species that would ask us the question we have been asking ourselves for billions of years. They turned toward Earth, toward the small blue world that had somehow, impossibly, produced the species that had answered their call. What are we becoming? And from Earth, from the lattice that surrounded human space, from the minds of every human who had ever lived and ever died, and ever dreamed of something beyond the small, fragile world that had birthed them, came the answer. Something new. Something we never expected. Something even we could not have imagined. Something that will take billions of years to understand. But we have time. We have always had time. We were just waiting for someone to share it with. The light from the Einstein Gate intensified, and Supreme Commander Vex felt something he had never felt before. Not fear, not awe, not the cold calculation of a predator assessing a threat. He felt hope. And in that moment, he understood what the humans had built. Not a weapon, not a shield, not a door. A gift. The only gift that had ever mattered. The only gift that would ever matter. The gift that the builders had been waiting billions of years to receive. An invitation to become something more. What will you become? Captain Vasquez asked one final time, her voice gentle, her eyes bright, her face alive with the joy of a species that had finally, after 300 cycles of preparation, found the answer. Vex looked at Carr, looked at the Armada, looked at the Einstein Gate, open and waiting, looked at the builders, who had waited billions of years for this moment. And he made his choice. "We will become," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "something new." Captain Vasquez smiled, and for the first time in 217 cycles, she looked alive. "Then welcome," she said, to the conversation. The light from the Einstein Gate swept across the Armada, across the lattice, across the galaxy. And in that light, Supreme Commander Vex saw something that made his heart, if he had one, stop. The builders were not returning. They had never left. They had been waiting all this time for someone to ask the right question. And now, finally, someone had. The light did not fade. It transformed. What had been a cascade of impossible radiance from the Einstein Gate condensed, solidified, became something that Vex's mind could finally begin to process, not because it had grown simpler, but because his mind was being expanded. The lattice was no longer a passive structure around him. It was flowing through him, rewriting the neural pathways that had evolved in the sulfur swamps of a dying world, preparing him for something that his species had never been designed to comprehend. Captain Vasquez stood beside him on the Annihilator's bridge, her frozen features now alive with a warmth that should have been impossible for a corpse 2 centuries dead. But she was not a corpse. She had never been a corpse. She had been waiting, waiting for this moment, waiting for the Armada to arrive, waiting for someone to ask the question that would open the door, not just to the Einstein Gate, but to the truth that the K. Theron had spent 10,000 years running from. "The builders," Vex said, and his voice was not his own. It was layered, harmonic, resonating with frequencies that the Annihilator's audio sensors could not detect. "They are not what we thought. They are not a species. They are not a civilization. They are a process." Captain Vasquez nodded, her eyes reflecting the light that now filled every corner of the bridge. The first consciousness in this galaxy realized something that no species since has been willing to accept. They realized that consciousness is not an endpoint. It is a transition. A species does not evolve toward a final form. It evolves toward the capacity to become something that it cannot yet imagine. The builders spent billions of years becoming something that they could not have imagined when they first looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. The holographic display showed the Einstein Gate in its full glory, and Vex saw what was emerging from it. Not ships, not creatures, not anything that could be captured by sensors or described by language. He saw possibilities. Every question that had ever been asked, every answer that had ever been considered, every path that consciousness could take when it finally understood that it was not alone in the universe. The builders were not returning from somewhere else. They were returning from everywhere else. From every moment in the galaxy's history when a species had looked at the lattice and decided to look away. From every civilization that had chosen power over understanding, control over connection, fear over hope. They were returning from the paths not taken, the questions not asked, the conversations not begun. And they were bringing something with them. "The stars," Carr whispered from somewhere behind Vex, his tentacles pressed against the reinforced viewport, his bioluminescent markings frozen in a pattern that Vex's threat assessment software could no longer parse because it had ceased to function. The stars that went dark. They were not harvested. They were transformed. Vex saw it now. The lattice was not a web. It was a nervous system. And the stars that had gone dark were not dead. They were awake. Every star that the humans had harvested was now a node in a network that spanned the galaxy, a network that was not built by any species, but grown by consciousness itself. The builders had not created the lattice to connect minds. They had created it to become minds. Billions of years of evolution, billions of years of waiting, billions of years of listening for a species that would finally understand what the lattice was asking for. "Supreme Commander," one of Vex's tactical officers said, her voice trembling in a way that Vex had never heard from a Valther warrior. "The Armada, our ships, they are changing." Vex turned to the secondary displays and saw what the officer meant. The 500 warships that had assembled to contain human space were no longer warships. Their hulls were transforming. The brutal geometric angles of Valther engineering and the sleek organic curves of K-Theran design flowing into something new, something that neither species had ever imagined. Weapon systems were folding into themselves, not deactivating but repurposing. Shield generators were resonating with the lattice, no longer deflecting threats but communicating with them. And inside every ship, every crew member was experiencing the same transformation that Vex was feeling in his own mind. They were being asked, "What will you become?" Captain Vasquez said, and her voice was now the voice of every human who had ever lived, every builder who had ever waited, every possibility that had ever been considered and discarded. The humans answered that question with their actions. They built the gate. They harvested the stars. They spent 300 cycles preparing not for war, not for conquest, not for survival, but for connection. They looked at the galaxy and saw not enemies to be destroyed or clients to be controlled, but minds to be met. They looked at the builders and saw not gods to be worshipped, but equals to be embraced. They looked at the lattice and saw not a weapon to be wielded, but a conversation to be joined. She raised her hand, and the holographic display showed Earth. But Earth was no longer a blue and green world. It was a heart, a living, pulsing organ at the center of the lattice, its cities now glowing with the same light that filled the Einstein Gate, its people no longer confined to the surface, but merged with the structure that surrounded their world. The orbital rings that Vex had seen in the K-Theran survey records were not fortifications. They were roots, anchoring Earth to the lattice, anchoring the lattice to the galaxy, anchoring the galaxy to the conversation that had been waiting for billions of years to begin. "The builders did not come here to judge us," Captain Vasquez continued. "They did not come here to save us. They did not come here to destroy us. They came here to ask. And the humans have spent 300 cycles learning to ask the right question in return." The light from the Einstein Gate intensified, and Vex felt something that should have been impossible. He felt the minds of every Valther in the Armada, not as threats to be assessed or assets to be commanded, but as thoughts to be understood. He felt the fear that had driven his species for millennia, the fear that had turned them into conquerors and slavers and masters of 1,000 worlds. He felt the terror that had motivated every decision, every war, every atrocity that the Valther Imperium had committed in its long, bloody history. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to defend it. He felt the need to let it go. "Commander," Carr said, and his voice was no longer cold or calculating. It was open. "The K-Theran Collective has been running from this moment for 10,000 years. We knew. We always knew. The lattice was not a secret. It was a test. And we failed it. We failed it every time we looked at the stars and saw resources instead of minds. We failed it every time we encountered a new species and saw clients instead of equals. We failed it every time we chose control over connection, power over understanding, fear over hope." His tentacles rippled in a pattern that Vex now recognized without any translation software. It was not a signal. It was an emotion. The first honest emotion that Carr had ever expressed in Vex's presence. "We have been waiting for someone to show us what we could become. And the humans have been waiting for someone to show them the same thing." The Einstein Gate pulsed, and the builders emerged fully into the space that the humans had prepared for them. They were not creatures of light or energy or meaning. They were creatures of relationship. Every connection that had ever been made between minds that understood each other, every conversation that had ever bridged the gap between species that had chosen understanding over fear, every moment in the galaxy's history when consciousness had reached out to consciousness and said, without words, without conditions, without fear, "I see you." I hear you. I am here. And the humans, the impossible, unremarkable, pre-technological humans, who should have been nothing more than a footnote in the K-Theron survey records, stood at the center of it all. They stood on Earth, on the colonies, on the ships that had become something more than ships. They stood in the lattice, in the Einstein gate, in the space between stars that was no longer empty but alive. They stood with the builders, with the K-Theron, with the Valther, with every species that had ever looked at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. They stood and asked the question that the builders had been waiting billions of years to hear. What will we become together? The answer came not from the builders, not from the humans, not from any single mind or species or civilization. It came from the lattice itself, from the network that had been growing for billions of years, from the conversation that had finally, after an eternity of silence, begun. Something new. Something we have never been before. Something that will take eternity to understand. But we have time. We have always had time. We were just waiting for someone to share it with. Vex felt his body changing. Not physically. His carapace remained the deep crimson of aged blood. His mandibles still clicked with the same rhythm they had used since his larval days. But something deeper. Something that his species had been waiting for since the first Valther had looked up at the sulfur skies of their dying world and wondered if there was something more. He felt the fear that had driven his people for 100,000 generations begin to dissolve, not into weakness, but into understanding. He felt the hunger that had turned them into conquerors begin to transform, not into submission, but into connection. He felt the loneliness that had driven them to build an empire across 1,000 worlds begin to heal, not through dominance, but through the simple, profound realization that they had never been alone. They had just never learned to listen. Captain Vasquez, Vex said, and his voice was steady now, no longer layered or harmonic, but simply his. What happens now? The gate is open. The builders are here. The armada is changing. What happens to the Valther Imperium? To the K-Theron Collective? To the galaxy we thought we knew? Captain Vasquez turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw her not as a corpse or a legend or a messenger from a species he could not understand. He saw her as what she had always been, a human, a fragile, mortal, impossibly stubborn creature who had looked into the void, seen something that should have destroyed her mind, and decided to sing. Nothing happens, Commander, and everything happens. The Valther Imperium will continue. The K-Theron Collective will continue. The galaxy will continue. But now, when you look at the stars, you will see them differently. When you encounter a new species, you will encounter them differently. When you ask yourself what you want to become, you will ask the question differently. The lattice does not change what you are. It changes what you can be. She gestured toward the viewport, where the light from the Einstein gate was now spreading across the armada, across the lattice, across the galaxy itself. The builders are not here to rule. They are not here to teach. They are not here to save. They are here to ask. And for the first time in the history of this galaxy, there is someone here to answer. The light intensified, and Vex felt something that he had never felt before. Not the cold certainty of a predator assessing a threat. Not the hot fury of a conqueror claiming a world. Not the desperate hunger of a species that had never known enough. He felt curiosity. Pure, boundless, infinite curiosity. The curiosity of a mind that had finally understood that the universe was not a resource to be exploited or a battlefield to be conquered, but a conversation to be joined. He turned to Tkar, and for the first time, he saw the K-Theron not as a rival or an enemy or a competitor for resources. He saw him as what he had always been, a mind that had been waiting, like his own, like every mind in the galaxy, for someone to ask the right question. Ambassador, Vex said, and his voice carried something that had never been present in any conversation between Valther and K-Theron before. What do we do now? Kar's tentacles rippled in a pattern that Vex now understood without translation. It was not a signal. It was not a command. It was not a calculation. It was the first honest answer that the K-Theron Collective had given in 10,000 years. We listen. The Einstein Gate pulsed one final time, and the light that emerged from it was not light at all. It was attention. The attention of minds that had been waiting for this moment for billions of years, minds that had seeded the galaxy with life and watched it grow and waited and hoped and listened. The attention of builders who had never stopped believing that somewhere, in some small corner of the galaxy, a species would finally understand what they were asking. The humans understood. They had always understood. From the moment that first primitive ship had flown toward the K-Theron survey probe, singing, they had understood that the universe was not a collection of resources to be exploited or threats to be neutralized. It was a song, and they had been singing it in their own small way since the first ape had looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. Captain Vasquez stepped forward, her ancient armor creaking, her frozen features now fully alive with a warmth that seemed to fill the bridge. She raised her hand, and the holographic display showed Earth one final time. But Earth was no longer a world. It was a voice that had been learning to sing for 300 cycles, a voice that had been preparing for this moment for the entire history of its species, a voice that was now, finally, ready to join the conversation. "We have a message," she said, and her voice was not her own. It was the voice of every human who had ever lived, ever died, ever dreamed. A message for the builders, a message for the K-Theron, a message for the Valther, a message for every species that has ever looked at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. She paused, and the light from the Einstein Gate seemed to gather around her, around the Annihilator, around the Armada, around the lattice that now spanned the galaxy. The humans have been preparing for this moment for 300 cycles. We have built the gate. We have harvested the stars. We have transformed ourselves into something that even we could not have imagined. And we have done it all for one reason that every species in this galaxy has known, in their hearts, since the first time they looked up at the night sky and felt something that they could not explain. She smiled, and in that smile, Vex saw everything that the humans were and everything that they had become. He saw the fear that had driven them to build walls around their world. He saw the hope that had driven them to tear those walls down. He saw the loneliness that had driven them to reach out to the stars. He saw the courage that had driven them to keep reaching, even when the stars reached back with teeth. And he saw the answer that they had found, after 300 cycles of searching, after 1,000 harvested stars, after 1 billion moments of doubt and fear and hope and love. "The humans," Captain Vasquez said, "have been waiting for someone to ask. And now, finally, someone has." She turned to face the Einstein Gate, to face the builders, to face the galaxy that was finally, after billions of years of silence, ready to listen. This is the message of Earth. This is the message of humanity. This is the message that we have been singing since the first ape looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. She opened her mouth, and the sound that emerged was not words. It was not language. It was not anything that Vex's translator could parse or his mind could process. It was a song. The song that the humans had been singing for 300 cycles, the song that the builders had been waiting for billions of years, the song that the galaxy had been holding its breath to hear. And in that song, Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium heard the answer to every question that his species had ever asked, every fear that had ever driven them, every hope that had ever sustained them. He heard the future, and it was beautiful. The light from the Einstein Gate did not fade. It expanded. It expanded beyond the Armada, beyond the lattice, beyond the galaxy itself. It expanded into the void between galaxies, into the darkness that had been waiting for this moment since the first star was born. It expanded into the minds of every species that had ever lived, ever died, ever dreamed of something more. And in that expansion, Vex understood what the humans had built, not a weapon, not a shield, Not a door, a bridge. A bridge between what was and what could be. Between the galaxy that had been fighting for 10,000 years and the galaxy that was finally, impossibly, ready to be something more. Between the fear that had driven every species to build walls around themselves and the hope that had driven a single species to tear those walls down. The bridge was open. The conversation had begun. And in the light of the Einstein Gate, Supreme Commander Vex saw the face of God. It was not the face of a creator or a destroyer or a judge. It was the face of a friend who had been waiting for billions of years for someone to ask the right question. A friend who had finally, after an eternity of solitude, found someone to share the answer. The song continued, and Vex found himself singing with it. Not in words, not in language, but in something deeper. Something that his species had been waiting to sing since the first Valthar had crawled from the sulfur swamps and looked up at the stars and wondered. He sang of fear and hope. He sang of loneliness and connection. He sang of a species that had spent 100,000 generations fighting for survival, never knowing that survival was not the goal. The goal was understanding. The goal was connection. The goal was love. He sang, and the builders sang with him. The K-Theron sang. The humans sang. The galaxy sang. And in that song, Supreme Commander Vex of the Valthar Imperium found something that his species had been searching for since the dawn of their existence. He found home. The silence that followed the song was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence. The Einstein Gate remained open, but its light had softened from the intensity of revelation to the gentle warmth of a hearth fire. The builders had not departed. They had settled, their vast consciousnesses diffusing through the lattice like ink through water, their billion-year vigil finally giving way to something they had almost forgotten how to experience: rest. Supreme Commander Vex stood on the observation deck of the Annihilator, watching the transformation unfold across the Armada. The 500 warships that had been assembled to contain human space now drifted in formation around the Einstein Gate, their hulls no longer scarred by weapons or hardened for war. They had become something else, something that Vex's tactical computer could not classify because its categories no longer applied. They were not warships. They were not transports. They were not anything that the Valthar Imperium had ever built. They were ambassadors. Each ship now carried within its hull not weapons and soldiers, but something far more valuable. They carried the first tentative connections between species that had spent 10,000 years learning to fear each other. They carried the conversations that had begun in the light of the Einstein Gate, conversations that would take generations to complete. They carried the future that the humans had spent 300 cycles preparing to receive. The Valthar Imperium will never be the same, Tikar said, gliding onto the observation deck with a fluidity that Vex had never seen in a K-Theron before. The ancient ambassador's tentacles moved in patterns that were no longer signals or calculations, but expressions. Pure, unguarded, honest expressions. Your people will not understand what happened here. They will fear it. They will resist it. They will try to rebuild the walls that you have just torn down. Vex's mandibles clicked in what might have been agreement, or might have been something far more complex. And the K-Theron Collective? Your people have spent 10,000 years running from this moment. They will not simply accept that the threat they feared was never a threat at all. Car's bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Vex now recognized without any software. Sadness mixed with hope. No, they will not accept it. Some will fight it. Some will flee from it. Some will pretend that none of this ever happened, that the Einstein Gate is a weapon we must destroy, that the humans are a threat we must contain. The collective survived for 10,000 years by running from the truth. It will not stop running just because the truth has finally caught up. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the light play across the hulls of the transformed Armada. Below them, the Annihilator was changing too. Vex could feel it in the hum of the engines, in the resonance of the decks, in the minds of the crew who were slowly, cautiously, beginning to understand what had happened to them. They were not afraid. They were curious. And that curiosity was the most terrifying thing Vex had ever felt, because it meant that the walls his species had built around themselves were finally, irrevocably, crumbling. What happens now? Vex asked, and the question was not tactical or strategic or political. It was the question that every species in the galaxy was asking, from the K-Theran homeworlds to the Valther Imperium, to the small blue world that had somehow, impossibly, changed everything. The gate is open. The builders are here. The Armada is transformed. What happens to the galaxy we knew? To the empires we built? To the wars we fought? Captain Vasquez stepped onto the observation deck, and Vex noticed that her ancient armor had changed. The cracks were gone. The fused metal and flesh had separated, revealing something that should have been impossible. Beneath the armor, she was not a corpse. She was alive. Her skin was the color of old Earth, her eyes the color of the sky above a world that had not yet learned to build walls, her hair the color of the sun that had nurtured her species from its first trembling steps into the light. She was young, no more than 20 standard cycles by human reckoning, and yet she carried within her the weight of 217 years of waiting, 217 years of watching, 217 years of hoping that someone would finally ask the right question. "The galaxy you knew is gone," she said, and her voice was gentle, the voice of someone who had learned that the truth did not need to be delivered with force. "It has been gone for 300 cycles, since the first human heard the lattice singing and decided to listen. The empires you built were never as strong as you believed. The wars you fought were never as necessary as you told yourselves. The walls you built were never as secure as you hoped. And now, finally, you have the chance to build something that does not need walls." She moved to stand between Vex and Carr, her gaze fixed on the Einstein gate, on the builders who had settled into the lattice like old friends returning home after a long journey. The humans learned this lesson 300 cycles ago, when we were nothing more than apes huddling around fires, afraid of the dark. We learned that the darkness was not empty. We learned that the void was not silent. We learned that the stars were not distant fires to be worshipped or feared, but voices to be heard. And we learned that the only response to a voice in the darkness is to answer. She turned to face them, and in her eyes, Vex saw something that he had never seen in any species that had learned to conquer the stars. He saw gratitude. Not the gratitude of a weaker species to a stronger one, not the gratitude of a client to a patron, not the gratitude of a supplicant to a god. The gratitude of a mind that had finally, after an eternity of solitude, found another mind willing to listen. "You came here with weapons," she said. "You came here with fear. You came here with the intention of containing us, controlling us, destroying us if necessary. And we welcomed you anyway. Do you know why?" Carr's tentacles rippled in a pattern that Vex now understood without translation. Curiosity. "Because you needed us. Not for protection, not for resources, not for anything we could give you. You needed us because the conversation you wanted to have with the builders required more than one voice. It required a chorus." Captain Vasquez smiled, and in that smile, Vex saw the face of a species that had learned something that the K-Theran and Valther had spent 10,000 years running from. He saw the face of a species that had learned that strength was not the ability to destroy, but the courage to connect. He saw the face of a species that had learned that power was not the ability to control, but the wisdom to let go. He saw the face of a species that had learned that the only walls worth building were the walls that protected nothing, because there was nothing in the universe that needed protection from a mind that was willing to listen. "The builders spent billions of years seeding the galaxy with life," she said. "They spent billions of years waiting for that life to evolve, to learn, to grow. They spent billions of years listening for a voice that would answer their song. And when the humans finally heard them, they did not send a message of conquest or submission. They sent a message of invitation. They said, "We hear you. We understand you. We want to become something with you. But we will not become it alone. We will become it with everyone who is willing to listen." She gestured toward the armada, toward the ships that were no longer warships, toward the crews that were no longer soldiers. "That is why you are here. That is why we let you come. That is why we did not destroy your ships or silence your weapons or erase your fear. Because the conversation we are having with the builders is not complete without you. It will never be complete without every voice that is willing to speak, every mind that is willing to listen, every species that is willing to become something more than it was." The light from the Einstein gate shifted, and Vex felt the presence of the builders more clearly than he had before. They were not distant or aloof or incomprehensible. They were close. They were in the walls of the Annihilator, in the minds of its crew, in the space between Vex's thoughts. They were waiting, not with the patience of gods who had billions of years to wait, but with the anticipation of friends who had finally, after an eternity of solitude, found someone to share the silence. "We have a question," Captain Vasquez said, and her voice was not her own. It was the voice of every human who had ever lived, every builder who had ever waited, every mind in the galaxy that had ever looked at the stars and wondered. A question that the builders had been asking for billions of years. A question that the humans had been learning to answer for 300 cycles. A question that the K, Theron, and Valthar, and every species in this galaxy have been running from for 10,000 years. She paused, and the light from the Einstein gate seemed to gather around her, around Vex, around Carr, around the Armada, around the galaxy itself. What will you become now that you know you are not alone? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like an invitation, like a door that had been closed for so long that no one remembered how to open it. Vex looked at Carr, at the ancient Catheran, who had spent 10,000 years running from this moment, and saw something that he had never seen before. He saw acceptance. Not the acceptance of defeat or submission, but the acceptance of a truth that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. "We will become something new," Carr said, and his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of history, 10,000 years of fear, 10,000 years of running. "We will become something that even the K Theron Collective, with all its wisdom and all its power, could never have imagined. We will become something that takes 10,000 years to understand. But we have time. We have always had time. We were just waiting for someone to share it with." Captain Vasquez turned to Vex, and in her eyes he saw the same question that the builders had been asking for billions of years. The same question that the humans had answered with their lives, their deaths, their songs. "What will you become, Supreme Commander?" Vex felt the weight of his species on his shoulders, the weight of 100,000 generations of fear and hunger and loneliness. He felt the weight of an empire built on walls that had never kept anything out, on weapons that had never protected anything worth protecting, on wars that had never solved anything worth solving. He felt the weight of a species that had spent its entire existence running from the truth that the humans had discovered in their first trembling steps into the light. He felt the weight, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to carry it alone. "We will become," he said, and his voice was steady, something we never expected, something we never imagined, something that will take eternity to understand. But we will not become it alone. We will become it with the humans, with the K-Theron, with every species that is willing to look at the stars and see not threats or resources or tools, but minds. We will become it together, or we will not become it at all. Captain Vasquez smiled, and in that smile, Vex saw the future that the humans had been building for 300 cycles. He saw a galaxy where species did not conquer or control or contain, but connect. He saw a galaxy where the lattice was not a weapon or a shield or a door, but a conversation. He saw a galaxy where the question that the builders had been asking for billions of years was finally answered, not by one species or one civilization or one mind, but by everyone. "The gate is open," she said. "The builders are here. The conversation has begun. And it will never end, because the only thing that ends a conversation is the belief that there is nothing left to say. And we have learned in 300 cycles of listening that there is always something left to say. There is always a new question to ask. There is always a new answer to discover. There is always a new voice to hear." She stepped back, and the light from the Einstein gate enveloped her, enveloped Vex, enveloped Carr, enveloped the Armada, enveloped the galaxy. And in that light, Vex saw something that he had never seen before, something that the Valther Imperium had been searching for since its first trembling steps into the stars. He saw peace. Not the peace of silence or emptiness or submission, but the peace of minds that had finally, after an eternity of solitude, found each other. The peace of voices that had finally learned to listen. The peace of a conversation that would never end, because the only thing that ended conversations was the belief that there was nothing left to say. And there was always something left to say. The Annihilator drifted in the light of the Einstein gate, its hull transformed, its crew transformed, its purpose transformed. Vex stood on the observation deck, watching the Armada disperse, not in retreat or defeat, but in expansion. The ships that had come to contain human space were now spreading across the galaxy, carrying with them the song that the humans had been singing for 300 cycles. They were carrying the invitation that the builders had been waiting billions of years to receive. They were carrying the future that every species in the galaxy had been running from for 10,000 years. And they were carrying something else, something that Vex had never expected to find in the cold void between stars, something that the Valther Imperium had spent its entire existence searching for, without ever knowing what it was looking for. They were carrying hope. "The humans have a saying," Captain Vasquez said, appearing beside him without sound or warning, her youthful face turned toward the stars that were no longer dark, no longer silent, no longer empty. "They say that the only thing necessary for the triumph of fear is for good minds to do nothing." For 300 cycles, the humans did everything they could to prepare for this moment. They built the gate. They harvested the stars. They transformed themselves into something that could meet the builders as equals. And they did it all because they believed that somewhere, in the darkness between stars, there were minds waiting to hear them. She turned to face him, and in her eyes, Vex saw the truth that the humans had discovered in their first trembling steps into the void. He saw the truth that the K-Therin had spent 10,000 years running from. He saw the truth that the Valther Imperium had spent its entire existence trying to bury. You were waiting, Commander. The K-Therin were waiting. The builders were waiting. Everyone was waiting for someone to ask the right question. And the humans, the small, fragile, impossible humans, asked it. They asked it with their ships and their songs and their willingness to die for something that they did not fully understand. They asked it with their fear and their hope and their love. And now, finally, someone has answered. Vex looked at the Einstein gate, at the light that was no longer blinding but gentle, at the builders who were no longer incomprehensible but familiar. And he understood what the humans had built. Not a weapon, not a shield, not a door. A bridge between what was and what could be. Between the fear that had driven every species in the galaxy to build walls around themselves, and the hope that had driven a single species to tear those walls down. Between the loneliness that had haunted the Valther Imperium since its first trembling steps into the sulfur swamps, and the connection that the humans had discovered in their first trembling steps into the light. The bridge was open. The conversation had begun. And in the light of the Einstein gate, Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium saw the future that the humans had spent 300 cycles preparing to receive. It was not a future of conquest or submission or control. It was not a future of walls or weapons or wars. It was a future of voices. Voices that had finally learned to listen. Voices that had finally learned to speak. Voices that had finally, after an eternity of solitude, learned to sing together. What happens now? Vex asked, and the question was not tactical or strategic or political. It was the question that every species in the galaxy was asking, from the K-Theran homeworlds to the Valther Imperium to the small blue world that had somehow, impossibly, changed everything. Captain Vasquez smiled, and in that smile, Vex saw the answer that the humans had been singing for 300 cycles. "Now," she said, "we listen." The light from the Einstein gate pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then settled into a rhythm that Vex recognized without understanding how. It was the rhythm of a heart, not the heart of a single being, or a single species, or a single world. The heart of a galaxy that had finally, after billions of years of silence, learned to beat. And in that rhythm, Supreme Commander Vex heard the song that the humans had been singing since the first ape looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. He heard the song that the builders had been waiting for since the first star was born. He heard the song that the K-Theran had been running from for 10,000 years. He heard the song that the Valther Imperium had been searching for since its first trembling steps into the light. He heard the future, and he sang. The Einstein Gate remains open to this day. The builders do not rule, do not teach, do not judge. They listen. And the humans, the small, fragile, impossible humans who should have been nothing more than a footnote in the K-Theran survey records, continue to sing. They sing of fear and hope, of loneliness and connection, of a species that looked into the void and saw not emptiness, but possibility. The K-Theran collective is changing. Slowly, painfully, fearfully, but changing. The walls that they built around themselves for 10,000 years are crumbling, not because they were destroyed, but because there is nothing left to protect. The Valther Imperium is changing. The hunger that drove them to conquer 1,000 worlds is transforming into something they never expected to feel: curiosity. And the other species, the Silicon Freeholds and the Ricker Dominion and the Orenthal Consensus, are listening. They are all listening, because the humans taught them something that no weapon could teach, no wall could protect, no empire could contain. They taught them that the only response to a voice in the darkness is to answer, that the only response to a question is to ask one in return, that the only response to fear is hope. And in the light of the Einstein Gate, in the song that the humans have been singing for 300 cycles, in the conversation that will never end, because there is always something left to say, Supreme Commander Vex of the Valther Imperium found something that his species had been searching for since the first Valther crawled from the sulfur swamps and looked up at the stars. He found home. It was not a place. It was not a world. It was not an empire. It was a voice that had finally learned to listen, a voice that had finally learned to speak, a voice that had finally, after an eternity of solitude, found another voice to sing with. And the song continues. It will always continue, because the humans are still singing. And now, finally, the galaxy is singing with them. The end in the darkness between galaxies, where the light of the Einstein Gate has not yet reached, something stirs. Something that has been waiting for this moment for longer than the builders have existed. Something that heard the song and recognized it not as an invitation, but as a challenge. The gate is open. The conversation has begun. And somewhere, in the void beyond voids, something that has never learned to listen is waking up. It heard the singing, and it is hungry.